Greetings and welcome to the final of the Transforming Assessment webinar series for 2014. Today's session will be by Professor Barney Dalgarno from the Sturt University, and he's now the co-director of the, I think it's the UI Imagine Center, which is a digital learning research laboratory. Barney is going to be talking about learning analytics and understanding of student learning strategies and outcomes involving scientific simulations. So Barney, if you would like to start off, please.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk. I'm going to enable my video just for a bit, just because that way people can kind of see who's talking, and then after a little bit I'll turn it off just to reduce the bandwidth. As you can see, I'm sitting in my office at work where I've got a better, more stable connection than at home. Yeah, so now you're welcome to ask questions as I go, and I'll try and keep my eye on the chat area to, so that I can answer them. I'll also try and pause occasionally for audio questions, and as Matthew said, feel free to put your hand up if you want to ask a question with the microphone as well, and hopefully I'll notice that as well. So the talk that I'm giving today, as the title suggests, is focused on an aspect of learning analytics, and particularly the use of learning analytics to understand student learning strategies and outcomes in the context of a specific learning scenario. It's quite relevant to a seminar series on assessment, as I'll point out, because I think if we can start to look at ways of understanding our student learning processes, then it helps us to understand the outcomes that we measure through assessment. So I think we're kind of heading into a whole new world where there's many more opportunities to understand the way in which our students are going about their learning, even when they're studying online and at a distance away from us. So good, thank you for Brant for saying the video is good. Yeah, it's always nice to kind of know if people can actually see or hear. Now, it's not new at all to be collecting data on student learning characteristics, their capabilities before they undertake some kind of teaching intervention, and their capabilities after that intervention. You know, that's kind of standard assessment and evaluation. And based on that kind of data, we can hypothesize, based on perhaps some kind of theory or some implicit sort of notion of theory, about the relationship between learner characteristics, the kinds of learning interventions or teaching approaches or learning designs that we put in place, and their outcomes. What's different about learning analytics is that through learning analytics, we can actually get at additional information about the learning processes, which allow us to form a deeper understanding of how the learning design can lead to learning outcomes. And in the study I'm going to talk about today, you'll see that sometimes it can be quite surprising what you find out. So I'm also going to argue here that there's only so far that you can go in the use of learning analytics to analyse and use data in a learning design neutral way. And you know, I've been a bit critical, I guess, of the huge focus in a lot of learning analytics work that's going on really kind of blunt instrument uses of analytics, where you look at across the whole institution. You look at the demographic data, you look at some really kind of basic kinds of data sources about the students' learning behaviours, you know, whether they've accessed the subject outline in their learning management system or not. And then you crunch the numbers and you find indicators of students at risk. And that's kind of useful and obviously, you know, important, because we really do need to find ways to improve our retention in our courses, but there's a whole lot more that can be done if you're prepared to start to use learning analytics in a much more learning design specific sort of way, and that's what I'm kind of trying to illustrate through this particular talk. So I'm going to talk about a study which used what I would refer to as learning sciences theories and methods to understand a general learning problem, but in the context of a particular learning design. And the methods that I've used, or that we've used in this study, because this is a study that I undertook with Gregor Kennedy and Sue Bennett, the methods that we used predate the term learning analytics, but they're very consistent with what people are now referring to as learning analytic methods. And as I said before, I think if we can, from an assessment perspective, if we can start to look at new ways of gathering data about a student's learning processes, it can help us to better understand the results of assessment, improve the actual teaching strategies that we're using, but there's also potential to start to assess students in different ways, because you can actually start to kind of assess their progress towards outcomes at particular points along the way by starting to look at learning processes rather than just the outcomes at the very end. So this particular study compared the learning performance of students who used a discovery-based design with students who used a tutorial-based design using multimedia learning resources and within the context of some scientific problem areas, which I'll go into in a minute. Now, what we did is we characterized a tutorial-based design as a design where students are kind of provided with information in a lockstep kind of fashion, and they are expected to kind of take in that information and form an understanding. And we compared that to a discovery design where, in a simulation context, students can actually experiment with and manipulate objects within the environment, test out their own personal hypotheses about the way that the different constructs within the learning domain actually fit together, and actually consciously try out different experimental scenarios in order to test out their particular knowledge representation. So the theoretical underpinnings that we're kind of drawing on here are based on constructivist theories of learning, which emanate originally from Piaget. And based on those kind of theories, you would expect that you would get greater learning achievement from students who are experiencing a discovery-based design because of the opportunities for them to actively construct their own knowledge representations and then successively expose these representations to scrutiny by experimenting within the chosen scenario. And the idea is each time they form a view as to what will happen when they manipulate a particular parameter, and then they see the results, they then either have their particular understanding confirmed, or else they revise that understanding and try out another experiment to see whether that modified version of their understanding is actually correct. So, plenty of people subscribe to a constructivist theory of learning these days, and most people would tend to think that students would learn more effectively through a discovery-based design than a tutorial-based design. Now, I'll just pause there in case anybody's got a question they'd like to ask at this stage. Now, is that Alison asking to get the microphone? So I think I can just leave mine on talk and you can just pick it up and go ahead, Alison.
No, she's running the audio setup wizard apparently.
Okay, that's what that says. Sorry about that. Okay, now Chris has said, would you mind turning off the video? And I wouldn't mind. That was about when I was planning to turn it off. So I'll turn the video off now, and hopefully that'll improve the audio quality and cut down the bandwidth. Okay, well, I'll keep going. The other thing I just wanted to say, I guess, is that it's those that are familiar with the discovery learning literature would know that pure discovery learning has generally not been found to be all that effective. So when we say pure discovery learning, we mean with no kind of instructional guidance, students are expected to experiment and develop their own understanding of a concept that's generally been found in most large empirical studies to be inferior to more kind of direct instruction approaches. And the way to get the best benefit out of discovery learning has been found to kind of scaffold that by providing some instructional information at the beginning to support the learning during the learning process, and also to use cooperative learning strategies to allow students to kind of be checking up with their peers as they go through. Now, in this particular study, we did provide some instructional guidance at the beginning so that students weren't flying completely blind. We didn't provide any kind of cooperative learning, and we didn't kind of provide support during the intervention. We were really keen to compare the difference between tutorial and discovery learning. We really wanted to kind of get to the essence of that difference. So we tried to make the two conditions as similar as possible, but with the ability to manipulate the simulations as the key difference. So, so if you're kind of looking at this going, that doesn't look like a very good discovery learning design, well, you know, we know that we weren't trying to use best practice in discovery learning. We were just trying to get at the difference in learning outcomes between the two approaches. And we also, I'll mention this a bit later, but we also had a separate study where we put participants in an MRI machine and compared their brain activations when they were using the two different resources as well. And so partly for that study, we needed to be very similar in the kinds of visual stimulus provided to the two groups. So that also led us to being quite, you know, consistent in the two types of resources, but with the ability to manipulate the parameters being the key difference. Yeah, so Tim says the key question is the discovery learning as good as the tutorial style learning? And, you know, that's exactly right. That's kind of the research question, and but there's some other kind of underpinning things as well that we'll get at. So the experimental design, we worked across two content domains, which were global warming and blood alcohol concentration, which we considered separately in the analysis. So you can kind of think of it as two separate experiments, one involving blood alcohol concentration as the content domain and one involving global warming. We developed resources using two learning designs in each content domain. So we had 4 resources in total: a discovery resource for global warming and a tutorial resource for global warming, and a discovery and tutorial resource for blood alcohol concentration. And in this study, we had 158 participants who were primary education students, and each student used the tutorial resource in one content domain and the discovery resource in the other content domain. So obviously you can't do the two in the one domain, because once you've done the learning, you can't relearn the same concept. And then we had a pre-test on knowledge within each content domain, a task using the 2 tasks, and then post-test on knowledge within each content domain. So Tim says, no, I mean, otherwise you are comparing bad discovery learning with good tutorial learning, or vice versa, end up not concluding anything generalizable. I wonder how you controlled for that. Have a look at the design we used, I guess, and make a bit of a judgment on that. I think what you'd probably say is that everything else was similar enough across the two that you can glean something about the benefits of discovery versus non-ability to manipulate the simulation through the study. Yeah, I've got examples of the materials. We'll get to that, Chris. So in each case, whether discovery or tutorial, we had a series of instructional screens at the beginning providing background to the content domain, an explanation of key terminology, but not including an explanation of the connections between the concepts. So you'll see, for example, that in the blood alcohol concentration resource, students were having to learn about the relationship between body weight, alcohol consumption, food consumed, sleep, and blood alcohol concentration. So we didn't tell them about those relationships, but we told them enough about the different constructs to be able to make sense of the simulation, and did similarly with the global warming. So whether in the discovery or the tutorial version, they had the same series of instructional screens. In the discovery version, they actually had the opportunity to manipulate the simulation, and they were encouraged to plan out their manipulations, mentally predict the output, and then observe the results. So let's have a look at the resources. This is the blood alcohol concentration resource, so relatively simple resource here with some input parameters that they can manipulate and a graphical output. So let's just have a look at that for a while because it takes a bit to get your head around it. So if we look at the things that can be manipulated are a person's body weight, the time they started drinking and the time they stopped drinking, whether or not they had a meal, the number of standard drinks, the time they went to sleep, and the time they woke up. So you can kind of manipulate those and then run the simulation. And what the graph on the right-hand side shows, the red graph is the blood alcohol concentration for those parameters that have been manipulated over a period of time. So you can see starting at the time that they started drinking, you can see it goes up and then it gradually goes down. The blue graph is a kind of a baseline measure. So based on preset values, those values, the label bills values, they're there on every screen, and it just gives the student a comparison point, so they can, if they want to, manipulate one variable different to Bill's values and see the effect on the output. So that's the blood alcohol concentration resource in the discovery version. The tutorial version looks very similar. It has the same kind of visual output on the right-hand side, and the only difference really is that instead of being able to manipulate the values, you just hit the continue button and it shows you the next set of values. And so they were provided with a set of predetermined values, which were kind of chosen to be systematic and working their way through different scenarios, typically changing one variable at a time when compared to Bill's values. And the idea was that the learner could, through just viewing those outputs, develop their understanding of the relationship between the input variables and the blood alcohol concentration. Yeah, that's right. So the independent variable here is the ability to actively control the input parameters. That's what's different between the two learning conditions, the tutorial and discovery condition. Thanks. Okay. So the global warming resource, which is slightly more complicated, and I guess we found this out a little bit through looking at the actual learning outcomes from the students. Less input parameters on the left-hand side, carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels, carbon dioxide emissions absorbed by plants across the planet, and CFC emissions from aerosols were the input variables. And then instead of a single output, which in retrospect we possibly should just have had a single output, global average surface temperature, which is your kind of main target variable, we actually had a series of intermediate outputs. And so what the students could actually do was develop an understanding of which variables affect which environmental factors, as well as working out the effect of individual environmental factors on the global average surface temperature. And there were more existing misconceptions, and we found in understanding of this area, but also just because of the complexity of the output, it seemed as though it was harder for students to kind of test out and get rid of their misconceptions or verify their understandings. And again, the tutorial version was very similar, but without the ability to manipulate the parameters. Now I'll just pause there in case anybody has a question about just the learning resources that we used in the study. No, all good. You're all completely on the ball. and making sense of it, I'll assume. But please do, put your hand up or keep asking questions in the chat. So let me talk about time. So I haven't got a slide on that, but it's about 20 minutes. I think that we allowed for each, and obviously for the discovery that could be as many iterations as they wanted in that time period. With the tutorial group, there was a set number of iterations, and it typically took 20 minutes. If they finished early, they were given the opportunity to kind of cycle back through and look at some of them again. So that was how we kind of controlled for time, was to get the tutorial participants just to keep cycling through and looking at them again if they finished early. So what the data we collected was pre-test and post-test, which were actually identical on conceptual understanding within these learning domains. So with the discovery version, we did give guidance on how it worked, and we actually gave them an opportunity to practice with the interface. We just had a test version of the interface that came in screens before they actually got into the resource. So they went through a series of just information screens about the content, and then the discovery learning group just had an opportunity just to practice manipulating the interfaces to make sure they understood how to use it. So we had multiple choice, multiple answer questions. We also had some open-ended questions in the post-test, which I'm not reporting here, but we used in other analysis. Questionnaires on cognitive load and engagement, which I'm not talking about here, but which is another source of data we could use as part of analysis, and we're still exploring. And we logged student actions, and that's really important for this, because as we'll see, we'll find out that log helped us to understand the learning processes that students used. So just to give you an idea of what the tests looked like, this is an example test item from the blood alcohol concentration domain. In this case, I think there's a single correct answer. A person with a greater body weight will generally have a lower blood alcohol concentration than a lighter person. And here's a question from the global warming domain, and I think this one has more than one correct answer, and they're expected to get all of the answers, the stems that are correct in order to get the mark. Which of the following environmental factors have a direct or an indirect effect on global average surface temperature? Amount of carbon dioxide absorbed by plants, not the thickness of the ozone layer, the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the greenhouse insulation effect. So 3 of those are correct answers, and the other one isn't. They have to get all 3 in order to get the mark. That's the way we marked the tests. And that did result in relatively low scores on the test. And when we tried analysing them in various different ways, but in the end we decided this was the kind of theoretically most sound way to analyse their answers. So let's have a look at the results. So what I'm showing you here is the pre- and post-test results. That is the mean score and the standard deviation score for the students on the pre- and post-test in the tutorial versus discovery group for the global warming, and the tutorial versus discovery group for blood alcohol concentration. Now, where's my... so there was a maximum score of 7 on global warming and a maximum score of 9 on blood alcohol concentration. So one thing you notice there is that the scores are relatively low in all cases. The other thing you notice is very little improvement from pre to post-test in either of the conditions, really. And we did a t-test just to compare pre versus post. And And you can see that there is a significant difference pre to post on global warming tutorial. Their actually score went down slightly. And there's a slight improvement in score for the discovery group from pre to post in the blood alcohol concentration. In terms of comparing the learning conditions, tutorial versus discovery, which is the key thing of interest here, there was a main effect of learning condition for blood alcohol concentration, with the discovery group doing significantly better than the tutorial group in terms of their improvement pre to post. The way we analysed it was with an ANCOVA, where the pre-test score was a covariant in the analysis. So essentially you're looking at their post-test scores, but you're controlling for pre-test scores in that. We found that to be a more sound way to do the analysis than to just look at the, the subtracting pre-test score from post-test score, for example. And no effective learning condition for global warming. So we were sort of surprised by some of that. And there are a couple of different things that we took into account. Do you want me to, does anyone want me to kind of explain that? I know this kind of stuff, people that do quantitative research would look at that and that all makes complete sense, but others might need me just to explain it. So if there's anything there you want me to just say again a bit slower or actually explain some aspect of that, please do ask a question. So t-test is just a statistical test that tests whether whether if you've got a group of numbers, a group of scores for one group of students and a group of scores from another. If the means are different, sometimes that difference can just be due to chance because there's fluctuation between those groups. So what a t-test does is it takes into account how much fluctuation there is, how big the standard deviation is, how big the sample size is, and it gives you a probability score that tells you the likelihood that there really is a difference between those groups. And so you typically use a threshold. The p is the probability of there being a difference. And if p is less than 0.05, usually what that tells you is that means you can be pretty confident that there's basically that's saying there's a 95% chance that there really is a difference between groups. So in looking at, say, the tutorial, the pre to post scores for the tutorial group in global warming, the fact that the p value is 0.027, that tells you there's a very high probability that there is a difference in their scores pre to post. And similarly, you've got p-values in the F-test that's used in the ANCOVA. So again, the p equals 0.02 for blood alcohol. It's less than 0.05, so it tells you that there really is an effective learning condition. There's a difference in the learning from the tutorial to the discovery group. Yeah, so why did the tutorial on the global warming make the scores go down? Look, I've spent a lot of time just going through the tests, the content, student scores to see whether there's a misconception introduced. Because obviously the first thing you think when scores go backwards is you think something's gone wrong here. We either marked the tests wrong, or there's something in the simulation that's leading students astray. So you tend to then analyse and look at which of the particular test items that they got right in the first case and wrong in the second case, and it's not systematic at all. I think all we can really say is that because the global warming was complex to understand, some students became more confused. Yeah, Brant says maybe they had more doubt. So some things they thought they were sure about, they became doubtful about. Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, so let's go on a little bit further because there's a bit more to this than what we see here. So, so in trying to understand what's going on here, we looked at a few things. We noticed that there was a fair bit of variance in post-test scores, particularly for discovery participants. Let me see if we can see that there. The standard deviation for discovery participants is higher than it is for tutorial participants, so there's more variance in their scores. In looking at the log files, we noticed that some participants had explored the simulation systematically and others had not. So you could really kind of see differences in the way they were going about things. Exploring the data by eye suggested that those who explored the simulation systematically, so we kind of, put in a spreadsheet, we lined up all the participants one after the other, and we just kind of made, looked at what values they put in for each of the parameters, and just kind of by eye, we were able to kind of see, it did seem as though the students that performed better were the ones who were systematic. That is, they tended to, change one variable at a time, or maybe make sure there was only one variable different to the bills values on the screen. So we thought, well, maybe there's some way we can characterize their exploration strategies and really test statistically whether there really is a difference between discovery participants who explored systematically and those who were unsystematic. I'm just reading Tim's question there. Did the discovery learners get to the same doubt and then move beyond that, or did they not even get that far? Tricky, hard to know. So then we looked at different ways of characterizing their exploration strategies, and it's particularly pertinent to this presentation because, as we start thinking about how we can use learning analytics to understand our student learning processes, we need to start thinking about, we're logging all this stuff, how do we make sense of those log files to kind of characterize the learner's strategies? And so in this particular case, we had data on the time they'd spend on the task as a whole, the time they'd spend on particular screens, the number of iterations through the simulation, the number of variables changed each iteration, including the number changed from the previous iteration and the number changed from the preset values, and the actual values they'd chosen. So all of those were things that we could take into account in our characterization of their learning strategies. So we've done a couple of different types of analysis, and the one that we found the most effective was actually turned out to be a reasonably simple, intuitively based, rule-based characterization. It was kind of consistent with our theory-informed understandings of what sorts of strategies we thought would be more effective. It would make intuitive sense that a student that changes one variable at a time or keeps one variable only different to the provided values, bills values or 2006 values, it's got a better chance of figuring out how a particular variable affects the output than a student that constantly changes more than one thing and therefore can't be sure what change led to the change in the output. So we looked at the data and we wanted to kind of divide the participants up into reasonably even-sized groups, and we arrived at the threshold of four cycles of changing one variable at a time as the threshold. So participants who changed one variable at a time on 4 or more cycles we classified as systematic, and we classified all the others as non-systematic, and then we compared the results. So what that next phase of analysis does then is it brings in a third group. So basically what we're doing then is we're comparing tutorial participants to non-systematic discovery participants to systematic discovery participants. And so we're interested in the relative learning benefits of those three different learning conditions, if you like. Their learning condition was the same for both systematic groups, but what they actually did was different. And suddenly we see quite a striking difference between the performance of those two subgroups within the discovery group. You can see there the mean scores for global warming on the post-test for non-systematic discovery was 1.33, but for systematic discovery was 2.48, hugely greater. And similarly for blood alcohol concentration, it's noticeably greater performance for the systematic discovery participants. And so when you do the ANCOVA, you can see that there's now actually a clear significant main effect of learning condition in both content domains. So it means there's a difference across the three groups. And in each case, when you do what's called a post hoc analysis to see where the differences are, the systematic discovery participants were significantly better than non-systematic discovery in both content domains, and there was no significant difference between non-systematic discovery and tutorial in each of the content domains. So Brandt characterises that as saying active learning is highly effective if the students are systematic explorers, and that's exactly right. It's not just people who make the effort learn more, because sometimes they make the effort, but they just don't do it in a kind of systematic way. So there's a real study skill here that they need to learn or be taught in how to explore a simulation systematically. And it's, it's classic scientific learning kind of processes. And, anyone who's taught science would know that students, especially if you've tried to teach science in an inquiry kind of way. I mean, there's a lot of laboratory sessions in the sciences which are kind of cookbook tasks, but if people have actually done inquiry tasks in the sciences, you often find that students flounder a bit because they don't quite know how to work systematically in order to discover the relationship between variables, or some do and some don't. How can they discover how to be systematic discoverers? Well, I reckon maybe. And that's the thing. And this is where, what would you do with the results of this? One thing you might do is to change the resources so that students get feedback during the system, so that you let them go for a bit and then you jump in and have the system pop up a message saying, I notice that you keep changing more than one variable at a time. It's quite likely this is going to lead you to confusion. Try changing one variable at a time. And I think with that kind of intervention during the task, they probably will learn or discover how to be systematic discoverers. Linda says she's going to change how she writes instructions for using a simulation. Excellent. Well, that's nice. We're going to have an effect. So let's... So let's just kind of talk about what some of the take-home messages from this might be. And let me just pause, I guess, for a sec again. Is there anyone who wants me to just explain any of that data a little bit more clearly? Because I mean, I'm probably going quite quickly for those that aren't statistically literate, and people are probably looking at others who are writing comments that imply that they understand, thinking, oh, it's just me. But there's probably 25 people out there that don't. So if you're one of them, please do ask a dumb question so that the others can get the benefit of me explaining it. Yeah, so we published a paper on this at the International Conference of the Learning Sciences last year. I think pretty much the analysis I've shown here today was published in that paper, International Conference of the Learning Sciences. I think there's a reference in the slides, so I'll put the references up at the end. Brandt says, like a pigeon in a Skinner box, the exploration has to be systematic enough to establish clear associations between stimulus and outcomes. Yep, that's kind of putting a behaviouralist interpretation on a kind of constructivist designed resource. Makes my mind hurt. So let me go on and just kind of talk about what some of the take-home messages might be. So the idea that pure discovery learning can be inefficient or ineffective for some learners is certainly consistent with some of the kind of seminal papers. There's a classic paper by Mayer, which is called something like, should there be a 3 strikes and you're out rule for pure discovery learning? And there's another paper by Kirshner with similar, which looks more theoretically at the situation. But there's some classic papers that have, made the argument that pure discovery learning doesn't work. Well, I don't think it's true that it never works, but it's certainly true that for some people it can lead to confusion. For some students, an active discovery-based design was ideal and certainly way superior to the tutorial design, so which does kind of counter those kind of global criticisms of discovery learning. So for others, the benefits of active exploration are countered by confusion caused by unsystematic exploration, and they do no better than tutorial participants. And so it's these students that we really need to think about changing the way that we teach them. So they didn't do very well in the tutorial either. So you certainly wouldn't want to say, oh, well, let's just get rid of the discovery and give them the tutorial. What you need to do for those students is to provide them with some kind of support or scaffolding to help them to explore the environment in a systematic way and focus on the key concepts within it. And so, you know, the simplest thing to do would be, you know, I mean, let me just say that we did, in the instructional material at the front, we very, very clearly advise the students to change one variable at a time. So, you know, they had that advice, but getting that in advance didn't make them do it. For a whole bunch of them, just kept changing multiple things. So it's those students that need something during the learning. And I mean, it could be just a reminder on the screen, but I do think if you had something that was reacting and telling the students that were changing more than one variable at a time that they would be better off considering changing one thing at a time, that would be the most effective intervention to kind of improve their learning strategy. So just in terms of characterizing exploration strategies, and I want to talk a bit about this because if we kind of try and generalize from the techniques that we've used here, you know, think about any kind of situation where students are learning online and you're logging what they do. It could be, you know, things like their access of particular resources, the way they go about online quizzes, the frequency that they're posting on forums, the way in which they engage with their peers. There's a whole lot of different things that you could be logging. And so thinking about some of the different strategies that you can use to kind of analyze those log files is certainly something to think about. And as well as, I mean, as I said, we used a fairly simple kind of theory-informed approach to characterizing them, but we actually explored a few other approaches as well. Gregor Kennedy and Terry Judd in some of their other work had used cluster analysis, and so it's a kind of classic technique where you just take where you've got a bunch of different variables on each participant. In this case, all those different things I said, time on different screens, time overall, number of iterations, variables change for iteration, and so on. And you crunch those numbers, and what it does is it produces kind of clusters of students who seem to be similar around those different variables. And then you compare the learning of the students in the different clusters to see whether a particular cluster did better than another. And then you kind of analyze how those clusters were, you know, which variables were the key things that were different between the clusters to see what kind of worked. And Gregor and Terry had used that in a number of studies to do that. So we did cluster analysis, and we did find that it, you know, crunched out, and we ended up with, I think, 3 groups rather than 2 in each case. I think one of the groups was mainly differentiated according to time on task. But they just didn't kind of seem to theoretically break down as well as the more blunt approach that we use, but it's an approach you can use. Kim Thompson, I think it is, at University of Sydney, has done some work using building on some work by Levy and Walensky, using different rules based on numbers of iterations and different values that they're using in a simulation, and then characterize students as kind of honing in on options straight to the point, or and they had different categories as well in manipulating an agent-based model. So that's worth having a read. And Gregor Kennedy also has done some more complex kind of data mining analysis techniques using hidden Markov models when he was analyzing a data set where he was gathering a huge amount of data about the way people went about using a tactile dental surgery, sorry, not dental, ear surgery simulation. And it's just kind of worth looking at some of the different things because, you know, it'd be great if we could get to the point where within our LMS systems, the analytics tools actually give us access to some of these algorithms so that we can actually start to, you know, crunch the numbers and explore the way that our students go about the learning tasks that we set for them within the context of the analytics tools in the LMS. At this stage, most of the analytics tools in the LMS really just based on really simple things like, you know, whether they've accessed subject outlines and that kind of thing. It'd be great if we could start to push the LMS providers to give us more sophisticated tools to play with. So Peter says, do you think the assessments you used captured student understandings as well as knowledge recall? Look, I think, in retrospect, I think we should have given them a longer pre and post test. We probably would have been better to simplify it so that there was only one right answer in each case. And then we would have had a score out of a bigger number. We probably would have got more variance in scores. And we could have more cleanly looked at what they did and didn't know through that assessment. So I do think the assessment wasn't perfect, and we, you know, would have got a kind of a clearer picture of the results if we had used better assessments. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the limitation of the rule-based method that we did use in this analysis that I've reported here is that there may actually be a range of different strategies that are, you know, within those systematic or unsystematic categories, and by actually using some of those more automated analysis methods, you might discover some other clusters of students and you might find out some other strategies. And that's particularly the case where there's quite a range of different strategies that students could be using. If you're thinking about students learning across a semester, there's, you know, you could compare students who are learning mostly individually, students that are spending a lot of time posting to the forum but maybe not engaging with the learning materials and the subject. There's quite a lot of variables that you could crunch in understanding the way students go about learning in, say, a university subject. Yeah, so just the pre-test scores between the two groups. Yeah, and what you're getting at there is that if there was a difference, then it's kind of saying that the systematic learners might also have been more knowledgeable or smarter. I don't think there wasn't a significant difference. There was a slight noticeable difference. It wasn't significant. And obviously we controlled for that difference by using pre-test score as a covariate in the analysis. But we did go down that pathway a little bit because Kirshner certainly has suggested that discovery learning is more effective for more expert learners. And so that was another part of the analysis we explored, was just kind of seeing whether you could break students down according to their pre-test to see whether students that knew a certain amount tended to learn more because they knew enough to kind of explore systematically or make sense of the output. But we didn't really find anything from doing that we could kind of really see provide us with clear advice. So I don't know. I don't think it was the case that expert learner equals systematic explorer, although you certainly might hypothesize that. But as I said, I don't think there was a significant difference between the pre-test scores of the systematic and unsystematic explorers. Yeah, so I mentioned cluster analysis that we used as the other approach. I mentioned 3-cluster solution, and time spent on the simulation was the other thing that differentiated between the groups. And the global warming was a 4-cluster solution. I forgot that. So there was one group that seemed to be completely disengaged, and I think they got completely confused and just started clicking at random. So that's right. So that's something we did discover from doing that cluster analysis, was that, you know, there actually was a 4th group in there. So I would very much suggest, of all those techniques, if you're doing this kind of analysis and there's not an obvious way of characterizing the difference, using cluster analysis is a good approach to kind of get at what sorts of different approaches there are. So take-home messages for learning analytics in general. I would say that learning designers and academic staff need more sophisticated understandings of the relationships between learning activities and outcomes. If you just focus on your teaching intervention and the outcome, as we did in the first analysis, the teaching intervention being tutorial versus discovery, and then compare the outcomes, you could make all kinds of conclusions about the relative benefit of discovery versus tutorial in this case, or other kinds of teaching interventions. But when you actually analyse the learning process, you discover something completely different, which pretty much says that discovery is way better, but with the appropriate support for the learners. As I said, techniques such as cluster analysis in particular have promise in characterizing learning strategies, but we need tools to make it easier to develop empirically informed characterizations of successful and unsuccessful strategies. And ultimately, if we can draw on that, then we should be able to use those things to then feed back into the next version of our resources to automatically provide tailored support based on this characterization. So, in this case, what we'd want to do is provide a kind of an automated mechanism to guide students to start changing one variable at a time. Well, if you discovered through your analytic analysis of learning processes while learning in your subject that too much forum activity and not enough engagement with the learning resources was a not very successful strategy, then you could have automatic pop-ups for students coming up saying, hey, it's really great that you're engaging with your peers, but make sure you do actually do your reading, or other kinds of, guidance. So that's where, doing the analytics and then building what you learn from that into kind of support for students is what we really need to get to. You're not sure this should be built. So Tim says, I'm not sure this should be built into the LMS. The LMS is just one place where learning happens. Yeah, well, that's the problem. And I mean, for us at Charles Sturt Uni, half our students study, or more than half our students study entirely online. So we get quite a lot from that analytics. But for the students that study on campus, obviously what happens in the LMS is only one piece of the puzzle. Most of the really interesting stuff might be happening in the cafeteria. And so you'd be mad to glean too much from just the LMS. And Brandt says artificial intelligence doing real-time analysis of strategy. Yeah, would be really, really interesting, and I'd love to see more research in that area. If you're doing it, Brandt, tell Matthew about it. He'll have to sign you up to do a seminar, or if you've already done one and I missed it, I'm really disappointed. So follow-up research, as I said, we're doing some more analysis of some of the other data that we collected and done a little bit on that prior knowledge, didn't really find anything there. And as I said, we've also done a study where we looked at the differences in brain activation patterns as deduced by MRI scanning between a smaller group of participants. And we've done a bit of analysis there, and it's not consistent. Like, you can look at a particular individual and you can see what they did, what they explored, how they went about it, what the results showed, and look at their interview and you can say, aha, I can see that brain activation pattern there is consistent with your activity. But when you kind of crunch the numbers across all of the participants, you don't find consistent differences between tutorial and discovery. So it's one of those things where MRI, I think, is a little bit limited for these kinds of holistic tasks where people at a kind of neuroscience level really do go about things differently, even if their behaviour looks as though they're reasonably consistent. So just acknowledging a few people there. I did this work with Gregor Kennedy and Sue Bennett. Terry Judd helped me with some of the programming on the blood alcohol concentration and also the audit trail, the logging on the global warming. Couple of people's resources online helped me with the global warming model. Michael Liu at the University of Melbourne is a key person in understanding blood alcohol concentration, so I used a model he developed, and we had a little bit of funding from a couple of sources. And there's some references. There's a couple of pages of references, but I'll leave that one up there because you can see that article that I mentioned there in the International Conference of Learning Sciences where we published some of that stuff. So let me stop there. I was talking fast because I've realised I promised Matthew I'd try and finish inside the hour. And I've answered a few questions as I've gone through. Anyone want to ask another question or pick up the microphone and make a comment?
Hi, Barney. I'm just moving the slides on so they'll be captured in the recording.
Oh, good. Yeah, do. Yeah.
Yeah. So while people are thinking about the questions, you might like to fill in our end of session survey. Thank you very much. That would be great. Remembering, of course, it's our final session for 2014, but we will be back again in the new year. So look out for more emails coming your way soon.
Paula says, what did the students say about the two approaches? Yeah, so we did interview the MRI participants. Yeah, I don't recall anything in terms of their evaluation of the effectiveness of the two approaches. Nothing that I could say consistently anyway. Any qualitative feedback? Yeah, same. I mean, we used the interview data just to triangulate when we were trying to understand the MRI participants, and we got them to look at a log of their activity and get them to comment on what they were doing at certain times, just in case they were distracted at a particular point in time. You can muck up an MRI study if your participants start thinking about something else for a while. So, yeah, but I'm not sure that we got anything major from those interviews apart from that. So thanks everyone for coming as well, and thank you for the really good, insightful questions in the chat area. It certainly makes for a better presentation if you can kind of see what people are thinking as you go through.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Barney. That was great. There was definitely some interesting conversation and questions. Hopefully that will continue again into our new year. So I'm going to stop the recording here, but feel free to hang around for a few minutes if you'd like. The recording will be posted onto the internet relatively shortly, and you will receive an email when that happens. So thanks all for attending, and see you all in the new year. Happy New Year and Christmas and all the rest of that.
Thank you so much for hosting it, Matthew.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Now, Susie is applauding, but also raising her hand, I think. So does that... now she's...
I think she might have been confusing the hand raising with the clapping button or something.
Right, okay, that's all right. She was waving one hand and clapping the other.
Yeah, clapping on one hand. Okay, so I'm going to stop now. So thank you very much all, and thank you, Barney, especially.